last few weeks, we've been exploring the topic of what is the gospel and how do we share it in our culture. I hope you found it a helpful and thought-provoking topic, because it's the sort of thing that it could be really easy to go your entire Christian life and not fully wrestle with this idea of what actually is the gospel. If you're joining us today, then I apologize, because this is part 3, and I don't have the time to go back over and go through part 1 and 2, but I'd encourage you to go back and listen to them. They're on our YouTube if you want to. But as a very brief summary, I'm going to try and bring us up to speed for what we've been looking at. So it began by I opened up this idea that the shorthand that's often used in the church for the gospel is sometimes unhelpful. And that shorthand sometimes goes like this: we're all sinners, Jesus came to die for our sins so we can go to heaven when we die. Now, of course, there are elements of truth to all of what I just shared with you there, but what it does is it zooms right in and misses the big picture of what God is doing through the gospel. Again, refer back to some of my previous talks before you throw anything at me. But God has created us to live in that perfect union with Him, to rule and to reign with Him. That despite our choices to reject Him and walk away from Him, He came to return us to that place of union with Him. The gospel, the good news, is the whole story has reached its climax in Jesus. God Himself coming to live, to die, to rise again back to life, so that God could kick off His plan to restore all of creation. And the amazing thing is, of course, He invites us to participate in that story, not just to be spectators of the story. We get to be these new creation people who live out bringing heaven to earth. And for me, at least, that sounds way more exciting and way more biblical than sometimes the way the gospel is portrayed. Last week, we shared a little bit about how do we go about sharing the story of the gospel. And yes, one of the ways we share the gospel is we just repeat the story back to people. But I believe one of the most important things we do with the gospel is to live in the story, to be in the story, to have our lives embedded in the story so that we're living it as missionaries in our homes, families, towns, jobs, etc. And then we're looking for those touch points between culture and the story. Today, I want to continue thinking a little bit about our culture and how our culture impacts the living in the story of the gospel. There's lots of other gospels in our world, as I pointed out last week. There's lots of other stories by which people live, things that give people meaning and purpose and direct their lives. The only way that we as followers of Jesus can be faithful to the gospel is to really, really live in the story, to firmly ground ourselves in the story of what the gospel is. And that's the only way we're going to expose some of the other stories for what they are. And I believe that the actual gospel story is the only thing that meets the deepest needs and desires that we all have. So today I'm going to explore 2 philosophies of our age, or 2 isms, if you like, 2 ways of thinking that are so deeply ingrained in our culture that we probably don't even realize or recognize them. We're going to explore them, and then we're going to pull apart how the gospel speaks into each of them. So the 2 challenges to the gospel we're going to look at today are individualism and consumerism. 2 isms for us today. And I'm going to try and define them as we go. So the first one, this, individualism. Individualism is the way of thinking that individuals are the supreme importance. There's an emphasis on self-reliance. We can do it on our own. And this need for privacy that is all about me and me alone. Individualism is opposed to authority or anyone else coming in to tell me as an individual what to do with my life. Now, individualism has actually brought us some great things in the Western church. Things like human rights and greater freedoms of equality across the world are all good things that have been brought in. But this modern expression of individualism has actually sits at odds with the gospel. And it's shaped the way we tell the story, and it's shaped the way that church happens and the way that church looks in our world. Our emphasis for sharing the gospel has become all about personal salvation. a personal relationship with God. People talk about having a private faith. Whatever you believe is fine, but just keep it to yourself. Maybe you're recognizing some of these things. Now, of course, personal salvation and a personal relationship with God are, in fact, great truths for us to celebrate. The story does bring salvation to us as individuals, and we now can relate directly to God. We don't need to relate through someone else, whether that's someone like myself or through the church. We have direct connection personally to God. But as is the way with these things, often the pendulum swings too far in one direction, and we have to then bring back into correction. Because fundamentally, the gospel story we've been exploring over the last couple of weeks is a collective thing. It's something that happens within the context of relationships and community. The goal of the gospel is that we live together as a new community, a new family. There is no category in the Bible for Lone Ranger Christians, but in our culture, there are lots of them. You see, in the Bible, when you accept Jesus as Lord and King of your life, you're immediately become part of a family, a collective new form of humanity. All the divisions, all the things that keep people separated have been obliterated by the gospel. We've got a verse up on the screen here, Galatians 3. There is neither Jew nor Gentile, neither slave nor free, nor is there male or female, for you are all one in Christ Jesus. That's the good news of the gospel, that we are brought together, not as individuals. But the truth is, individualism kind of suits us well, if we're honest, because relationships are hard. Overcoming our differences, the people we just see life differently with, is hard. Overcoming our differences, our hurts, and walking in light and community is not the easy road. The idea that we can have a relationship just with God sounds wonderful and a lot easier, doesn't it? But it's not the gospel. The New Testament is much more communal in its language than we often give it credit for. We tend to take verses in the Bible and they're written as like plural, like written to a group of people, and we tend to make them personal very quickly. So for example, when Paul writes and he says, we have the mind of Christ. Most Facebook memes that you're going to see that have that verse are going to say, I have the mind of Christ. We personalized it, but actually what Paul was saying is that we, this new community, together, working together, have access to God's thoughts. It's a we message, and it can be misunderstood if it all becomes I. Now, I've said this to us before, but imagine the days of Jesus in the Gospels that we read about there, where becoming a disciple and becoming part of a community were the same thing. When Jesus said to his disciples, follow me, there was not an option to follow him but stay on your own. There was not an option to be an individual in the group of disciples. To follow Jesus was to join this kind of odd group of men that were following Jesus around. To follow him was literally to join community, but we've separated that in our culture. I actually don't think you can be formed in your journey with Jesus without other people. There's apparently, someone else did the counting here, 59 one another's in the Bible. 59. Things like love one another, honor one another, serve one another. Now, all those commands are much easier to do on your own, aren't they? Much easier to do on your own. But here are some of the ways that individualism shapes us. We're going to put these up on the screen. And we're just going to rattle through them. So the first one is probably an attitude you might recognize. I recognize it certainly in myself. Nobody gets to tell me what to do. Now, this speaks right into the heart of some very serious issues in our culture around the whole area of authority. And I don't have time today to fully unpack the topic of authority. But in our culture, most authority, someone telling you or having authority over you is seen as an incredibly negative thing. And perhaps for good reason, authority has been abused. People in authority do bad things. They put control onto people. But biblical and healthy authority is not about putting people down, but lifting them up. Healthy biblical authority is about creating a platform for others to shine. And in the biblical model, rather than nobody tell me what to do, we willingly submit ourselves to one another. We willingly, so it's not forced, but we willingly come in and we submit ourselves to others. What a challenge to our culture. Next, we keep all our struggles private. Yeah, I'm doing fine, thanks. Everything's rosy. This is the fruit of individualism, where all the problems we have stay on the inside. And other cultures, if you travel to other cultures that have a more communal lifestyle, that just doesn't exist. You just tell everyone what's going on in your brain. All the thoughts that come in just come in and go out. And that we, of course, need to have healthy boundaries. This isn't an invitation to go and tell everyone all your problems. But in our culture, we tend to be very individual and private. Next, we try to solve all our problems ourselves, which is a bit like toddlers, for any of you with toddlers right now. I do it myself. If we're honest, we all have a little bit of that in us. That's like, no, I don't need to get help for this. I can figure it out myself. Or we emphasize our rights rather than our responsibilities. Again, this is massive in our culture. People are very quick to be like, that's my right to do this. It is my right to do that. And rights are great things when they're actually paired up with responsibilities. But when rights become the main thing, we lose sight of the gospel. And very much related to that is the next one I put up, which is that we're unable to give up our freedoms. Sometimes the Bible calls us, again, not with control, but willingly to give up our freedom for the sake of someone else. What a radical thought in our culture. That yes, you would have freedom, but you would choose not to use it. What a radical thought. And finally, we expect church to be just the way we like it. A few smirks in the room like, oh yes, I do like church the way I like it. I really wish they would do my favorite songs a bit more. And we all fall into these traps. And I recognize these things because I'm guilty of every single one of them. But I believe these are evidences that individualism is forming us. I want my independence. I don't want other people telling me what to do. Individualism is alive and well in the church, and it's our desire to be fully autonomous, to survive on ourselves, and ultimately it leads us to being self-centered. But the gospel is that we actually lay down our lives for others. We lay them down. Now, in our modern world, we try and curate our lives, which is to say we try and edit them. We try and make them exactly how we want them. We build a life that suits us. We build comfort, but community is actually deeply uncomfortable. And that's the antidote to individualism. We'll go to the next slide. The solution, the response to individualism as the gospel is community. Now, community is a funny word in our culture because it's used all over the place. And community, when you say the word, sounds like this wonderful ideal, like some sort of Friends episode or something, where everyone just gets on well and it's just this bubbly place. But I've put this very encouraging quote at the bottom here. We are wounded in community and we are healed in community. Both of these things are true. And as a church, we need to just be honest with that. You can't be with a group of people and not get wounded. But you also can't get healed on your own. So perhaps some of you have walked through some really hard things in the past. You've been hurt. You're walking through hurt. And that hurt feels still very real to you. The only way through that hurt and to be into healing is this very thing that brought you the pain. We are both wounded and healed in community. Perhaps you identify with that. So how might this radical Jesus community look for us? Well, here's some things. I'm going to rattle through these very quickly. Firstly, we need to learn to accept help. Let someone help you. Sometimes in community, we need to let it cost someone else to help you. We don't like that in our culture because we're very British and we don't like to inconvenience someone. But sometimes you have to let someone be inconvenienced to help you. Like it has to be that I'd rather solve that on my own, but actually I need help. So if you're in this community and you need help, Ask for it. You might be robbing someone of the opportunity of serving you. Share your struggles with someone. Again, this isn't about telling everyone all your problems, but there needs to be people in your life that you show your weaknesses to, your challenges to. Thirdly, pay a price to be in community. That means show up even when it's not convenient, you're a bit tired, or there's much better options. Not that there would ever be any better options than church or small group, I'm sure. But we just need to be willing to pay a price to do things that are not always the top of our mind. Yes, self-care is important, which has become a buzzword in our culture. But often self-care is just an excuse to be self-centered. Then we need to learn to share our spiritual life and our prayer life with people. I'm always amazed, and it's not said with judgment, but the number of people as Christians who struggle to pray with other Christians. And I'm like, no, we need to be opening up something of our spiritual life with one another. There's something about praying with other people, becoming slightly less private in your spiritual life, doing it with someone. Fifth, meet someone you don't know. Just break the silence. Meet someone today and say, I don't know you. Do you want to meet up sometime? It's not difficult. And then the last one is quite challenging. Invite someone else that loves you. It needs to be someone who's actually for you, into your decision making. Don't just make a decision. Invite someone else into your decision making. But what if they recommend something I disagree with? What if they want me to do something I don't want to do? What a radical idea. I heard of a small group in a church who they all agreed, and again, willingly, not controlled, not from above, they agreed together they wouldn't make any large financial decisions without consulting the rest of the group. I'm not going to buy that new car until I just say to the group, here's the new car I think I'd like to get. And they're not doing it out of a controlling way. They're just doing it out of, I actually don't have all the answers and I want to follow Jesus. So if I submit my decisions to you, I ask that you speak into them. How many Christians do I see who just make decisions left, right, and center without involving anyone else in the process? I'm like, this is a community. Get some opinions. And again, it's from people who want the best for you, not just people who want to give you an opinion, people who love you. But what about submitting your decisions to someone else? Now, community is not a kind of personality thing. It's not introvert versus extrovert. We're all invited into community. Everyone's going to have a different amount of people time they can cope with, but we're all called to live in community. You know, extroverts might struggle with having alone time, and introverts might struggle with our gathered times, but both of them are healthy to us following Jesus. So the truth of is that we're all wrapped up in this story together. We're not an island, we're a community, and the gospel is supposed to be lived out in that community. And community is not easy, but it is what we're made for. And I believe that in a world struggling with loneliness and isolation, this is one of the solutions the gospel provides. It's not perfect, we're not going to hurt each other, we're not going to get it right all the time. But actually a community who's seeking to build something valuable in relationships, I think we've got something powerful to offer the world there. So the invitation in the gospel is to lean in to community. Next point, consumerism. Now, consumerism is a philosophy where we all get to play the role as consumers. We long to acquire more and more goods and services. The invitation is that the next purchase we make is going to be the thing that fulfills us. Now, you don't need me to tell you that this culture grew up in a context where people realized that if they could tap into our desires, they could make a lot of money. If people could really tap into the things we want most, there's no shortage to the money they could make. Big companies, as you know, spend a lot of money and time just so that you're aware of their brand, their product. It's ridiculous amounts of money. And they analyze our shopping habits to determine what we're most likely to buy next. They take like millions of patterns across our internet purchases in our country and then go, oh, they bought this. That means they're going to like to buy this next. And all of us, we like to pretend like, oh, I'm above all that. I'm wiser than the marketing companies. But the truth is, they're actually tapping into something we want. And we're much more predictable than we like to admit. We're being sold to all the time. They understand they can use beauty, sex, status, wealth, and power to make some of the most mundane products look attractive. And so the challenge to the gospel here is that the gospel works very differently. We're not consumers of the gospel. God doesn't interact with us like a transaction that you're buying. And the problem is that as consumers, we're being trained in an opposite direction. We're being trained that we have a wide variety of choice. We can just pick according to our preferences. We can customize. And as we know, the customer is always right. And so the problem with this training we're being trained as consumers is it's unhealthy for our souls. It's not the way that we're made to work as humans. The world is not a series of transactions. Relationships are not a tit-for-tat service industry, and God is not like that either. The gospel is not a transaction, it's a relationship. So it has major implications on how we approach community, rather than like when we think about people coming into our community, people use lots of words, coming to salvation, conversion, which is not necessarily a word I like because I feel like it is a little bit on the consumerism end of things. But people coming into our community and learning to follow Jesus, we need to think, what approach are we expecting? Perhaps rather than looking for that moment that they come in and they pray a prayer, we need to look at it a bit more like our relationships. Think about a moment, someone who's a friend of yours. Now, the way that friendships tend to work is there doesn't come a point and you go, now we're official friends. It kind of works like that in primary school. But when you become an adult, you don't just get to a point and you go, now we're friends. Sometimes you've built up a friendship with someone and then you hear them talking about you to someone else and you go, oh, here's my friend, Neil. And that's the point you go, oh yeah, we're friends. But it isn't like there's not like a moment where we go, we've signed the contract, now we're friends. And I think it's like that when we come to Jesus as well. At some point we become friends, but it's not always like about the moment. Sometimes we later recognize the moment and we recognize that transition point, but I think it's a much more accurate picture of discipleship. I love that the disciples Jesus picked don't actually realize that he's the Son of God until towards the end of the ministry. And yet he says, come and follow me. And they follow him, and they don't know who he is, really. They're kind of just following him along. And it's not too much later they go, yes, you're the Messiah. Thank goodness we've been following this guy around for a while. So there was a gap, like if you were talking the salvation language, when did the disciples get saved? Maybe they were following Jesus for a while before they actually realized who he was. There's lots more I could explore there. I just think it's an interesting model for how we think about people coming into our community. We need space for people to come in and belong and have relationship before they believe anything. A space where people can come in, be themselves, ask questions, disagree, and build relationships. And I believe most of that's not going to happen in this room. Most of that is going to happen in your homes, at your workplaces, in the coffee shops, in the restaurants, with your family. It's not going to happen in this room. And that's okay. But we need to let people experience the good news. Jesus began discipling people before they even believed in him. And I love that thought. I don't know how to fully articulate it. What if we went out and just started discipling people before they even believed in Jesus? What would that look like? I'll have to explore more of that another time. But as I said last week, our main job isn't to try and provide a new marketing campaign for God. Like he just needs to spruce up his marketing a little bit and then people are going to come flocking into him. It's about us living in the story of the gospel and sharing why we have that hope. Now, consumer Christianity shows up in the way that we as people come to Jesus as well and the way we come to church. It's the difference between how will Jesus meet my needs today and how can I glorify Jesus? How's Jesus tapping into my needs? in the same way that a marketing person does, versus how do I live my life as worship and adoration to the King of Kings? It's a very different approach. Maybe you've heard or said these phrases. Again, no guilt, no shame. I've probably said them all as well. You know, that worship really didn't do it for me today. This isn't a comment on today, Bill, don't worry. But how many times have you heard someone say, it didn't really do it for me today? Do you know, I didn't get anything out of small group last week. I didn't really enjoy that sermon. Do you know, I've been attending church for weeks and nobody's invited me for a coffee. I've been attending church for a year and I'm not become more patient. Now, these things can all they can be truthful statements, or they can be a sign that we've actually put ourselves at the center of the story. We've put ourselves at the center of the story. And we can all be guilty of these things. But I'm going to give us 3 antidotes to consumerism in our culture. And we're going to go through them quickly. Slow obedience, apprenticeship, and generosity. I think in a culture obsessed with consumerism, we need to come in an opposite spirit. We begin by realizing that church isn't about what we can get, but it's about what can we bring and give. I'm sorry to say it, but your enjoyment is not the goal. I'm sorry to burst that bubble. Your enjoyment isn't why we're here. My enjoyment isn't why we're here. I'm not saying it should be horrible and you don't enjoy it, but that's not the highest goal here. Sometimes people will annoy you. Sometimes the shiny church down the road is going to look much more attractive than this one. But the gospel invites us to lay down our preferences for the sake of something bigger, to come and bring relationship and generosity. And I think that when we all lay down our preferences is how you get unity. It's how we build something that's united. We don't treat church like some sort of Amazon purchase where if we're not happy, we'll just get a refund. Again, we're being trained in ways that are unhelpful. The gospel doesn't promise our lives will be rosy until God restores all things. But before then, there's going to be difficult times. There's going to be uncomfortable teachings. There's going to be times where God presses us and disciplines us. The invitation of church is not to join a club and pay your membership fees. It's to pledge your allegiance, your whole life to Jesus. And no matter what, to follow him. Wherever he leads you, however he leads you, to follow him. So when our culture trains us to seek instant gratification, we choose slow obedience. Slow obedience, Eugene Peterson famously called the Christian journey a long obedience in the same direction. Now, there are moments where God impacts our lives and perhaps we, in a moment, get transformed and God shapes and changes something in our lives. I'm not wanting to minimize that. But the normal Christian life is obedience week after week after week, day after day. Doing the next right thing again and again. It's putting habits in place on a weekly basis that on the surface look like they do nothing. It's doing things weekly that on the surface it looks like, I'm not getting any of the results I want. But it's like training, isn't it? It's like, I'm not a runner, but because of my wife, I get an inside track, pardon the pun, into the world of running. And it's not that you suddenly jump from nothing to a marathon. It's that you train every day or every second day, and eventually that enables you to do the things that you couldn't have done before. And the Christian life can be like that. We do things weekly that don't seem glamorous, they don't seem exciting, but over a lifetime, they shape and they change us to be like Jesus. Slow obedience in a culture obsessed with speed. Next, we choose to be apprentices. We make Jesus our King and we follow him. We've talked about that already today, that we follow him. We become apprentices. I've got a quote from Dallas Willard. I think I put it on the screen. I can't remember though. He says this. It's not a good sermon without a Dallas Willard quote. The greatest issue facing the world today with all its heartbreaking needs is whether those who by profession or culture are identified as Christians will become disciples. Students, apprentices, practitioners of Jesus Christ, steadily learning from him how to live the life of the kingdom of heavens into every corner of human existence. Dallas is saying that the most important thing is whether those who call themselves Christian with a label will actually live out in apprenticeship to Jesus. Let his words shape us. Let the path that he guides us to be the path we choose. And being disciples doesn't mean all pain and gloom. Don't worry, I'm not painting it like that. It does. You do get your desires met, but there's an order to the way it works. Psalm 37, verse 4, which I think is on the slides as well. Take delight in the Lord, and he will give you the desires of your heart. Most people skip to the second part. But if we'll choose to take our delight in God, if we'll put God first, that's where he meets our desires. And then finally, generosity. When our culture trains us to get, we choose to give. That's the way of Jesus. Nothing reshapes our attitudes to the stuff that we're collecting, the consumerism in the world, than radical generosity. Now, as a family, we practice giving 10% of our income away as a gift to God. And we just say, no, we want to be generous. And let me tell you, there's some amazing things we could do with the money that we give away. Oh, I could think of the amazing holidays we could have. I could think of the amazing new car we could purchase. I could think of, yes, guitar. I need more guitars. Bill's right. But we don't. We choose to come in an opposite spirit to our culture that says more, and we choose to give. Life is not found in the abundance of possessions is a hard message to live by in our culture. But if we're generous and we give, I believe we're working in God's spirit, not the spirit of our age. So whatever it looks like to you, when that impulse for more comes, what do you give away? How can you be generous in your life? How can you develop contentment in a culture that is trying to provoke you to be discontent all the time? How do you live in contentment? I'm still figuring that one out. So we've looked today at two areas of our culture, individualism and consumerism. Individualism, where we put ourselves at the center of everything, and consumerism, where our preferences and our choices become the most important thing. And I kind of just want to finish with, this is the end of this short series on the gospel, and I would encourage you to kind of review back over the last 3 weeks, or last 2 weeks and today, because I hope that the ideas that we're sharing kind of help to shape where we go in the future and how we as a church continue to be outward facing, being a blessing to our communities. We want to be relational in the way that we share the gospel. We want to not have this really slimmed down, easy to say story. We want to live the story. We want to take big paintbrushes and paint this massive picture of what the gospel looks like and invite people to come and look at it. I want to conclude this series on the gospel just by looking at a parable. And it's a wonderful parable because it's a one-sentence parable. It's pretty good if you can do it. So it's Matthew 13:44. The kingdom of heaven is like a treasure hidden in a field. When a man found it, he hid it again. Then in his joy went and sold all he had and bought the field. The good news, the gospel, is like that treasure hidden in the field. Imagine the man's reaction, stumbling across treasure in the field. And he'd be delighted, he'd be excited. But this treasure is going to cost him. The way to get the treasure is to buy the whole flipping field. That's how you get the treasure. Buy the field. Now, to an observer who doesn't know about the treasure, this looks over the top. It looks like out of character. Why are you selling off everything you have? Because he knows about the treasure. It seems outrageous. But no, he's seen the treasure. And the treasure is worth more than the field. The treasure is worth more than 10 fields. It's actually a no-brainer. If I came to you and said, I will give you £1 million if you gave me a tenner. Now, apart from thinking I was running some sort of dodgy pyramid scheme or whatever it might be, it'd be a no-brainer. A tenner for £1 million. Of course, let me do it. And it's the same with the gospel. It's going to cost you everything. but you're going to gain back so much more. The gospel is of infinite value. So I want to finish this series by just saying, buy the field. Buy the field. The gospel is worth it. Don't visit the field, look at the treasure from a distance, buy the field. The gospel is amazing. God has plans to restore all things. He has cleared the way for us to live in his presence today, for us to be agents in his kingdom here in East Lothian, to learn how to live in his kingdom differently, to bring justice and righteousness to our region, that we might make East Lothian like heaven, that we might experience the infinite joy and peace of knowing God, of being invited into relationship and into community to grow for all eternity. I finish with this quote with Jim Elliot, who was a missionary who sadly died trying to bring the good news to an unreached people group in the jungle of Ecuador. And he famously said this: "He is no fool who gives what he cannot keep to gain what he cannot lose." Let me pray, and I'm going to hand back to Rob. God, I thank you for the story of the gospel. I thank you that you have a great plan for our world, our cosmos, and for us as individuals. As we live in our culture, God, help us to be aware where the story differs in our culture. Help us to be wise, and help us to live in such a way that we compel people to receive the good news of Jesus Christ. Amen.